Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the systemic roots of the global affordable housing crisis. I mean, look at almost any major city in the world right now. You're going to see a skyline totally defined by towering cranes and shiny new luxury developments, right? But down on the ground, existing right alongside all of that, there is a desperate struggle for everyday people to just keep a simple roof over their heads. So, the big question we're investigating today is this. Why, despite all our modern advancements, massive leaps in construction tech, and honestly, vast global wealth, is finding an affordable home literally harder than ever? We're building more than we ever have, yet the supply of housing that average earners can actually afford is vanishing before our eyes. It's kind of the central mystery of our modern economy. But take a look at the date on this quote, 1872. This perfectly describes our modern housing crisis. You know, the colossal increase in rents, the sheer impossibility of finding a place. But it was written 150 years ago by Friedrich Engels. He famously called it the housing question. What we're experiencing today, it's not some glitch in a brand new system. It's actually a historical cycle. Back in the day, city planners practiced what Engels called breaching. Basically, they'd clear out lower-income areas to build grand boulevards or commercial spaces, which didn't solve poverty, it just shifted it somewhere else. Sound familiar? Today, we see a remarkably similar process of gentrification. Only instead of industrial barons, it's driven by globalized real estate investment. Section 1. The 150-year housing crisis. To really get a handle on this, research from the European Journal of Spatial Development points us to a perfect real-world laboratory, Romania. Watching a country rapidly switch from state socialism to neoliberal capitalism lets us see exactly how changing the rules of the economic game physically reshapes the landscape. The research shows that housing isn't just some byproduct of an economy. The way we plan housing actually facilitates the transformation of the entire political economy. It's the engine, not just the caboose. Section 2. Housing as a commodity. Basically, the way a society defines and treats housing fundamentally dictates who gets to live where. Let's look at state socialism, like in Romania prior to 1990. Housing functioned as a state-planned collective consumption good. They had massive industrialization, which meant they needed to house the workforce, right? So the state funded huge blocks of public housing using the surplus value created by labor. It wasn't about making a profit off the home at all. It was entirely about sustaining that workforce. On the flip side, under neoliberal capitalism, housing is treated as a financial asset. It's completely market-driven. The goal dramatically shifts from providing shelter to generating yield, hooking local real estate directly into globalized financialized capitalism. Section 3. The shift to neoliberalism. When states stepped back from the business of providing homes, they didn't just leave an empty void. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of spatial planning through a process known as de-planning. Now, de-planning isn't just the absence of planning. It's a very specific political choice. It's the withdrawal of the central state from organizing a territory for social cohesion. So local government's role shrinks down to basically just rubber stamping private construction plans. And this withdrawal, it allows the private market to prioritize profit over community needs. Developers and global investors step right in, focusing heavily on speculative land development and luxury housing, simply because, well, that's what yields the highest returns. Now, if you layer all these modern compounding factors on top of de-planning, things get wild. The research identifies a few key drivers here. First, we have a demographic trend towards single households, which means we just need way more total units. Then we have historically low interest rates from central banks over recent years. This diverted massive amounts of savings and investments straight into real estate. Add in rampant real estate speculation, and finally, the privatization of housing policy, which basically means the loosening of rent controls and the huge sell-off of public housing. When you combine all of these ingredients, you get an economic engine perfectly calibrated to drive housing prices absolutely through the roof. Section 4. Poverty and spatial segregation. To see the truly tangible human impact of these massive economic shifts, let's look at some data from a UNIT's research paper focusing specifically on Austria. Plus 32%. According to data cited from the Abbé Pierre Foundation, that is the shocking rise in the homelessness rate in Austria. Despite being a very wealthy nation, the shrinking supply of affordable housing and skyrocketing rents are pushing people not just to the margins, but totally out of the housing market entirely. Researchers point out this isn't just a simple market failure, it's a profound breakdown of the social contract, directly threatening the UN Sustainable Development Goal of leaving no one behind. And for folks who aren't pushed into homelessness, the research describes the creation of what they call poverty islands. As rents spike and affordable housing totally disappears from city centers, lower-income households get displaced. They're gradually pushed into the few remaining pockets they can afford or entirely out into the surrounding suburbs. This is about so much more than just housing, you know? It's about how spatial segregation rigidly dictates a person's access to good infrastructure, better jobs, and overall societal participation. Section 5, Policy Limits and Resistance. Now, obviously, governments and everyday citizens aren't just sitting around idly. There are interventions happening. But institutions like EcoAustria highlight the serious limits of our current policy toolbox when faced with a fully commodified market. First off, widespread rent control. While it's great for protecting current tenants, economists argue it can actually reduce the incentive for private investors to build more, potentially making the shortage worse over time. Second, social housing. Particularly in places like Austria, where a huge chunk of the population uses it, it often lacks strict needs testing. That means middle-class earners might occupy subsidized units while lower-income earners are stuck waiting. And third, pure financial subsidies just don't solve the core root problem, the absolute shortage of physical affordable units. These policies treat the symptoms for sure, but researchers argue they often fail to cure the underlying systemic disease. Because those top-down policies so often fall short, we're seeing intense bottom-up resistance. The sources introduce us to a fascinating real-world example. Wem gehört die Lasker Keys? Or translated, Who owns the Lasker Keys? It's a grassroots neighborhood initiative right in the Friedrichshain district of Berlin. Local residents there mobilized in response to large developers sweeping into their neighborhood to build mega luxury offices and high-end micro-apartments. The locals argue that these developments will hyper-gentrify the area and totally displace the current community. This quote from the activists really hits the nail on the head regarding the on-the-ground reality and the massive disconnect between speculative capital and what a community actually needs. They point out that developers often claim their luxury builds will improve a neighborhood with things like green spaces or fancy open cafeterias. But the locals argue these amenities aren't built for them. They're explicitly designed to attract a higher-paying demographic, which ultimately raises the local cost of living and forces the original residents out. So what we're looking at is a very clear, localized clash over whether the city space should serve the social needs of its residents or the yield requirements of global capital. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to wrap up this explainer. We've seen that the exact housing shortage angles diagnosed 150 years ago is still fully operational today. It's driven by treating housing as a financial commodity, the deplanning of our cities, and the very real limits of our traditional policies. So the question you have to ask yourself is this: can the housing question ever truly be solved as long as a home remains, first and foremost, a financial asset? Or is this 150-year-old cycle of inequality simply going to continue building? It's a massive question, but understanding the mechanics we've explored today is absolutely the first step to figuring it out. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and we'll see you next time.